Imagine this. Your husband walks out on you with nothing but a cold text message and a heartless goodbye. But what if I told you that those final words, "You'll regret this," were the beginning of something you never saw coming? Stick around, because while he thought he was walking away with everything, I was quietly building the most unexpected revenge. It was a regular afternoon, the kind that's easy to overlook like any other. I was in the middle of folding my laundry, the hum of the dryer in the background when my phone buzzed. At first, I didn't think much of it, until I saw his name flash across the screen. It was a text, simple and cold. The words came one after another, each sentence hitting harder than the last. "I'm leaving you. I'm moving out. I'm with someone else now. You'll regret this. Goodbye." Those were his final words. No conversation. No explanation. Just a text that shattered everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage. I didn't even cry at first. I should have, right? My heart should have been breaking, my world crumbling beneath me. But instead, I sat there, staring at the screen in disbelief. Was this really happening? After everything we'd been through? After all the years? I could hear the echo of his last words repeating in my head. "You'll regret this." And yet, in that moment, I felt no regret, no pain, no anger. Just a strange kind of calm. The kind of calm you get when the storm has already hit, and now, you're just waiting for it to pass. I glanced over at the clock. It was almost dinner time. I had to pull myself together. He wasn't going to see me broken. I wasn't going to let him have that satisfaction. So, I picked up my phone and called my best friend. I didn't have to explain much. She could hear the tension in my voice. "Do you need me to come over?" she asked. I took a deep breath. "No, not yet. But I'll need your help soon." I hung up, staring at my phone one more time, as if somehow I could wish the text away. But it didn't work. The words stayed there, etched into my mind. My husband, my partner for the past 12 years, had just walked away, and I was left with nothing but his harsh words and the overwhelming silence of an empty house. The worst part? The realization that he had planned this for months. The signs had been there. The late nights, the strange phone calls, the sudden obsession with his appearance. And when I found out about her, Melissa, his receptionist, everything finally clicked into place. I wasn't the only one he'd been keeping in the dark. But that didn't matter right now. What mattered was that he was gone. And I was left to pick up the pieces of my life. "You'll regret this." The words echoed in my head again. But this time, something inside me shifted. He thought he was leaving me shattered, broken beyond repair. But what he didn't realize was that sometimes the greatest strength comes from the moments when you feel most vulnerable. And I would prove that to him. It was time to move forward. As I sat there, replaying the text in my mind over and over, I began to piece together the puzzle that had been my marriage. How had I missed all the signs? How had I ignored the small things that now seemed so glaringly obvious? It wasn't just the late nights at work that never seemed to match his paychecks, or the sudden changes in his behavior, like the way he'd started dressing differently, almost trying too hard to recapture his youth, or the strange new interest in the gym, a place he'd always avoided, as if he was trying to become someone else. Then there was the night that stood out most in my mind, the night I found the receipt for dinner for two at an upscale restaurant, on a night he claimed to be working late. I had opened our shared credit card statement, and there it was, staring me in the face, a charge I didn't recognize. That's when the doubts started to creep in. But even then, I wasn't ready to face the truth. I didn't want to believe, yet I remember that night so clearly. I walked around the house, holding the receipt in my hand, feeling like a stranger in my own life. My husband had always been a man of routine, of predictability. But now, nothing about him seemed to make sense. I felt this creeping unease in my chest, a gnawing feeling that something was terribly wrong. But I pushed it aside. I didn't want to confront the inevitable. But deep down, I knew something was off. I didn't confront him that night. Instead, I quietly made the decision to open a separate bank account. I didn't tell him. Not at first. There was something in my gut telling me to be prepared. So, I did what I could in secret. I moved a little bit of my personal savings over into this new account, just in case. I didn't want to believe he would ever betray me. I didn't want to accept that the man I loved could be hiding something so deep and ugly. But as the weeks went on, the signs grew harder to ignore. Passwords started changing. He became more secretive about his phone. And even when I tried to ask him about it, he deflected. His answers were always vague, always brushing me off as though I was the crazy one for even asking. When he suggested combining our bank accounts, I agreed, but only because I had already taken the necessary steps to protect myself. He didn't suspect a thing. I smiled through it, all while moving the majority of my savings into my new account, keeping just enough in the joint account to make him think everything was fine. He never questioned it. Then came the final blow, the one that should have shattered me. He emptied the joint account, every last cent. The money we had saved together. The money that had been meant for our future. It was gone in an instant. But I didn't fall apart. I didn't panic. Instead, I locked the door to the house, took a deep breath and walked out of the room. He thought he was outsmarting me. He thought I'd crumble under the weight of his actions. But what he didn't know was that I was already steps ahead. I let him make his move. He didn't know it, but I was watching. I had been preparing. Every little piece of his betrayal, every moment of doubt, had been carefully documented. And now, the pieces were finally falling into place. Mark had thought he could just walk away, leaving me with nothing but empty promises. But as he walked out the door, leaving me with that final cruel text, he didn't know that his biggest mistake wasn't leaving me. It was underestimating me. I wasn't going to beg for him to stay. I wasn't going to let him have the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. Instead, I was about to show him just how wrong he was. The days after Mark left were a blur of emotions: anger, confusion, sadness. But what struck me the most was the overwhelming sense of peace that slowly crept in. I thought I would fall apart. I thought I would be consumed by the hurt, the loss, and the betrayal. But instead, I felt something unexpected. Calm. It was as if the storm had already passed. And now I was just waiting for the calm to catch up. The first few days were difficult, of course. I'd come home to an empty house, the silence feeling heavier than I'd ever known. I didn't have anyone to share the small victories with. No one to laugh with about the little things that used to matter. But as time went on, I realized that the silence wasn't the absence of love or life. It was the beginning of something new. I threw myself into work, into the boutique I had built from the ground up. It had always been my passion, my pride. For years, Mark had called it my little shop, belittling it, diminishing it. He never understood what it meant to me. He never understood how much effort, sweat, and tears I had put into growing it. But now, in the quiet aftermath of everything, I had found my escape. I spent hours at the boutique, unpacking new shipments, reorganizing displays, and focusing on something I could control. It became my sanctuary. It became the place where I could breathe, where I could think clearly. Every time I worked with a customer, it was like taking a step further away from the hurt, from the anger, from the betrayal. I also started to reconnect with friends I had lost touch with over the years, I found support in places I never expected. Messages of encouragement, offers to help, and women who shared their own stories of heartbreak and strength. It was these conversations that reminded me that I wasn't alone, that so many women had been in my shoes before, and they had found a way through it. They had emerged stronger, more resilient. And I would too. But the most surprising part of this period was how little I missed Mark. The more time passed, the clearer it became that he wasn't the man I thought he was. I had spent years building a life with someone who hadn't been as invested in me as I had in him. His midlife crisis, his affair with Melissa, his sudden need to prove something to the world. It all came into focus. I realized that the man who walked out on me wasn't the same person I had married. He was someone who had lost his way, and in doing so, had lost me too. I was finally starting to see the truth, and while the pain of his departure was still there, it was becoming more and more distant. The hurt was fading, and in its place was something far more powerful. The realization that I was going to be okay. And that was when it hit me. The truth I had been too afraid to face before. I was better off without him. He thought he was leaving me in pieces, that I would be devastated by his exit. But what he didn't understand was that in his absence, I had started to rebuild. I was starting to rediscover who I was outside of being his wife, outside of the shadow of his control. I wasn't broken. I was becoming whole again. I spent a few more days in that calm, soaking in the space I had to breathe, to think, and to plan. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. It wasn't going to be a future with Mark. He had made his choice. And now, I was making mine. It didn't take long for Mark to reach out. After all, his departure had been so sudden, so final. He must have thought I would be left in a state of emotional chaos, desperate for him to come back. But the first text I received from him wasn't an apology or a sign of regret. It was more of the same arrogance that had characterized his behavior before. I know this is hard, but we both need to move on. You're better off without me. But I just wanted to make sure you're okay. I stared at the message for a while, not knowing how to respond. What did he expect from me? Sympathy? An understanding nod from someone he had just thrown aside like a broken toy? I could almost hear his voice, the self-satisfied tone, as if he believed he was the one doing the right thing. And yet, here he was, reaching out to me after everything, after he had emptied our joint account, after he'd left me for a woman half my age. My initial impulse was to respond, to tell him exactly how I felt, to remind him of the hurt he caused, the way he betrayed me. But I stopped myself. That's what he wanted. He wanted me to react, to show him that I was still vulnerable, still desperate for him. Instead, I did nothing. I didn't text back. I didn't call. I didn't let his words affect me like they used to. For the first time in a long time, I felt control. It was like a switch had flipped inside me, and I was no longer the woman who waited anxiously for his return. The texts continued over the next few days. He tried to play it cool, pretending he was the one in control now. But I knew better. This wasn't about him trying to be the better person, or making amends. This was about him trying to soften the blow of his own guilt. He wanted to see if I would take him back, if I would accept him back into my life without consequence. One evening, another message popped up on my phone. "You're making a mistake. You'll regret this. You know that, right?" There it was again. You'll regret this. His mantra, his way of controlling the narrative, of making me feel small, of making me second-guess my decision. He thought that if he repeated it enough, it would convince me to take him back. But I wasn't buying it. He didn't know what I had been doing behind the scenes. While he was playing the victim, trying to guilt me into taking him back, I had been building my life. The boutique was thriving, and I had already begun to see the fruits of my labor. His messages didn't scare me. They didn't shake me. They only showed me just how little he had understood about me, about who I was now. I didn't reply to that last text. I didn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, I focused on something that mattered: my business. That's when I started to realize how much power I had in this situation. For so long, I had let him call the shots, letting his manipulation define my emotions and decisions. But now, I could see the bigger picture. He wasn't in control anymore. I was. Mark's words, "You'll regret this," now felt like a faint whisper, a ghost from the past. They no longer had the power to haunt me. Instead, they served as a reminder of how far I had come, how much I had grown, and how much I had yet to achieve. And as his messages continued to flood in, I simply kept going. I let them roll off me like water off Aduk's back. It was time for him to realize that the one who would regret this was him, not me. A few weeks passed before I heard from him again, but this time his tone had shifted. The cocky, dismissive attitude from his previous messages was gone. In its place was desperation. He began to apologize, admitting that he had made mistakes. But I knew better. I had seen this pattern before. The first message came as I was preparing for a new shipment at the boutique. I was surrounded by boxes, organizing new inventory when my phone buzzed. I half expected it to be another of his manipulative attempts. But when I looked, it was different. I was wrong. I should have never left you like that. I miss you. I've realized what a huge mistake I made. I want us to work things out. Please give me a chance to fix this. My heart didn't race. My stomach didn't twist. I read his message, my mind calculating what his real intentions were. Was this sincere? Or was it just another plea because he was facing the consequences of his actions? I couldn't deny that a small part of me had hoped for something like this, for an apology, for some acknowledgement of the pain he caused. But another part of me, the stronger part, the part that had been growing in the past few weeks, reminded me of why I was better off without him. It was no longer about love. It was about respect, trust, and the realization that I had been living a life where my feelings came second, where his decisions, his mistakes, always outweighed my needs. I didn't rush to respond. I knew what I needed to do. I took a deep breath and reminded myself of everything I had learned during this time. His behavior hadn't changed. He was still trying to manipulate me into feeling guilty for choosing myself over him. He was still playing the victim, still assuming that I'd fall into his arms with open forgiveness. He sent another message soon after, this time more pleading. I know I messed up. You're probably angry at me, and I deserve it. But I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you. You were always the most important thing in my life, and now I see that. I'm lost without you. Please, Claire, give me another chance. Let's fix this together. The emotional pull was there. I couldn't deny that. Who wouldn't feel a sense of nostalgia for the man they had once loved, even if he had broken their heart? But then, I thought about the past. I thought about all the times I had put him first, the sacrifices I made for him, for our relationship, and how in the end, it hadn't mattered. He had walked away with a smile on his face, leaving me with nothing but shattered promises. No, I wasn't going to fall for it this time. I sat down at my desk, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as I typed a response. Calm, controlled, and firm. No drama, no anger, just clarity. I don't think you understand, Mark. I've spent the last few weeks realizing that I don't need you in my life anymore. I am not the same person I was when you left, and I'm not interested in going back to that. I've built something for myself, something I'm proud of, and I'm not willing to let you come back in and tear that down. I've moved on, and it's time for you to do the same." I hit send, the finality of my words resonating through me. He replied almost immediately, but I didn't even bother reading it. It didn't matter anymore. He had made his choice, and now I was making mine. I closed my phone and returned to my work. The boutique needed my attention, and there was no room in my life for his drama, his guilt, or his empty promises. I was moving forward without him. And as the days went on, I realized just how much strength I had found in myself. His desperate pleas for forgiveness didn't faze me. They were just another reminder of how far I had come. Mark's last words before leaving me had been, "You'll regret this." But as I looked around my life now, I saw nothing but progress, nothing but growth. And all I could think was, who's regretting now? As the days passed and Mark's messages grew more desperate, something inside me solidified. I was no longer the woman waiting for his approval, the one who had anxiously hoped for his return. I was no longer the woman who had lived in the shadow of his needs and expectations. I had moved past that. The woman I had become over the past few weeks was confident, self-assured, and in control of her own destiny. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized something important. I had all the power now. It wasn't just about Mark anymore. It wasn't about his betrayal or the hurt he caused me. It was about the strength I had gained from it. I was no longer playing his game. He was the one scrambling to win me back, to manipulate me into forgiving him. I could feel it in every message he sent, in the desperation that leaked through his words. But I wasn't playing that game. Not anymore. The power shift wasn't immediate. It was subtle at first. It was in the way I no longer felt the need to check my phone every time it buzzed with a message from him. It was in the way I had started to feel proud of what I had built, how far I had come. It was in the way I no longer saw myself as a victim, but as a woman who had survived and thrived after betrayal. The first time I realized the shift was when I ran into one of our mutual friends at a coffee shop. We had been close during our marriage, and it felt like a lifetime ago when we had all hung out together as a couple. She was surprised to see me looking so good, so composed. "I can't believe how well you're doing, Claire," she said, almost in awe. "You look amazing, strong, like you're living your best life." It was a small comment, but it hit me hard. I realized in that moment that people were noticing. People were seeing the transformation I had gone through. And they weren't seeing the woman who had been devastated by Mark's departure. They were seeing the woman who had risen from the ashes. At that moment, I understood that Mark had underestimated me. He thought that by leaving me, he was taking away my stability, my sense of self. He thought he was sending me into a downward spiral of regret and heartache. But what he didn't realize was that I had always been strong. I had always been capable. I had just been putting my energy into someone who never truly appreciated me. Now, that energy was mine again. I realized how much I had been holding back during our marriage, how much I had suppressed my own desires, my own dreams, for the sake of keeping the peace with him. I had neglected myself. And that was the biggest mistake I had made. But now, I was reclaiming everything I had lost. I was reclaiming my confidence, my independence, and my self-worth. And that was more powerful than anything Mark could ever take away from me. He had thought that his departure would leave me broken, lost, but instead, it had given me the clarity I needed to see just how strong I really was. The control had shifted from him to me, and I wasn't going to give it back. I stopped responding to his texts. I stopped looking back. And with every passing day, I grew more certain of my decision. I didn't need him. I never had. He had underestimated my resilience. He had underestimated the woman he thought he could walk away from. But now it was clear. I was stronger, smarter, and far more capable than he ever realized. and I was only just getting started. Mark might have thought he was taking everything from me when he left, but in reality, he had given me the most precious gift of all, the freedom to be myself again. And that was something he could never take away. The weeks dragged on, and with each passing day, I found myself becoming more certain of one thing. I was done. Mark's messages had become increasingly frantic, desperate even, but they were all the same. Apologies, pleas for forgiveness, excuses for why he left. But they never once acknowledged the true depth of his betrayal, never once took responsibility for his actions. It was always about him, about his regrets, about what he needed from me. He hadn't changed. He just wanted to put the blame on me and manipulate me into feeling guilty for his mistakes. I had been giving him time, thinking that maybe he just needed to come to terms with everything. But the more he begged, the clearer it became. He wasn't sorry for what he'd done. He was sorry that he was now facing the consequences of his own actions. His texts became more manipulative. I still love you. We can work this out. I know I made mistakes, but I can change. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. The words echoed in my mind, each one more hollow than the last. How many times had I heard the same promises before? How many times had I been the one to forgive, to move forward, to believe him? I had given him every chance to prove he could be the man I needed. But instead of stepping up, he had broken me. He had left me for another woman, emptied our joint account, and made me feel like I wasn't enough. He had used me, lied to me, and betrayed my trust in ways I couldn't even begin to count. But I wasn't that woman anymore. The one who stayed, who forgave, who waited. I wasn't going to let my life be dictated by his mistakes and manipulations. I had worked hard to rebuild myself, to become strong, to stand on my own 2 feet. And no amount of begging from him was going to undo the progress I had made. One evening, I sat down and thought about everything, about how far I had come since he left, about how much better I was without him. My business was thriving, my personal life was finally on the path he wanted, and I was starting to feel like myself again. Mark was a distant memory, a person who no longer had the power to hurt me. I couldn't keep putting my life on pause for him, hoping he would change, hoping that he would realize what he had lost. I had to let go for good. So, I made my decision. I was going to cut him off completely. No more second chances. No more hoping for an apology or a change. He had made his choices, and now I was making mine. The next morning, as I sat at my desk, in the boutique, I wrote my final response. I was calm, clear, and firm. There would be no room for negotiation, no space for him to worm his way back into my life. Mark, I've made my decision. I'm not coming back. I've spent far too long trying to make a broken relationship work, and I refuse to go down that road again. I've rebuilt my life, and I'm not going to let you tear it down. I hope you find what you're looking for, but I am moving on. For good. I sent the message and then turned off my phone. I knew there would be a flood of texts, a flurry of calls trying to change my mind. But I didn't care anymore. The woman I was now wasn't the one who would beg for love or forgiveness. I had learned that my worth didn't depend on anyone but myself. I had come too far to let him back in. Mark had walked out of my life once, but now I was the one making the exit. And this time, there would be no turning back. It's funny how much closure can come from simply walking away. After sending that last text, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The kind of relief that only comes when you stop fighting a battle that you've already won. I didn't need to keep revisiting the past, rehashing the same mistakes, and re-explaining my decision to someone who would never understand. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. I wasn't carrying the weight of his betrayal, his guilt, or his manipulations anymore. It was just me now, and that was more than enough. The next few days were a blur of clarity. I spent them focusing on my business, my friends, my passions, everything that had taken a back seat during my marriage. The boutique was booming, and the energy of my customers, their support and excitement, filled me with an incredible sense of pride. It wasn't just a store. It was a symbol of everything I had worked for, everything I had fought for, and everything that had brought me back to life. But it wasn't just my business that was growing. I was growing too. I found myself doing things I had always wanted to do, taking up hobbies, making new connections, traveling more. I even started dating again, though it wasn't about replacing Mark. It was about rediscovering who I was and learning to enjoy my own company again. And as the days went on, I realized that there was a whole world outside of the marriage I had once thought defined me. It wasn't easy, but every small victory felt like a giant leap forward. And then came the unexpected. Mark. His messages still came, though less frequently now. The last tone I received read, "You've ruined everything. You were my life, and now I have nothing." I deleted it without hesitation. I had no desire to rehash the past or deal with the guilt he was trying to project onto me. I had already walked away from that life, and I wasn't looking back. My life was mine again, and I wasn't about to let him ruin that. A few months passed, and I got a call from a mutual friend. Apparently, Mark had been trying to make amends with his family, trying to win them back after everything had fallen apart. He was still holding on to the illusion that he could reclaim his old life, but the truth was that it was slipping through his fingers. Meanwhile, I was thriving. The boutique had expanded into a second location, and I was considering even more growth. I had plans for a new line of luxury accessories that would elevate the brand, and I was finally in a place where I could do what I wanted without having to explain myself to anyone. I had heard through the grapevine that Mark had started a new relationship, but honestly, I didn't care. He was no longer my problem. His life had taken a nosedive, while mine was on the rise, and that was the best form of closure I could ask for. One afternoon, as I was finalizing an order at the boutique, I received a message from Mark's sister. She told me she had seen him recently, and he had been talking about his regrets, about how he had taken everything for granted, including me. I didn't know what to say, but then I remembered something that made me smile. The last laugh wasn't this to take any more. I replied simply and without malice. You're right, he did take everything for granted, but I've built something amazing, and I don't need him to appreciate it. It's all mine. And just like that, I closed that chapter. No bitterness, no anger, just peace. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving anything to him. It was about realizing that I was worthy of more than the scraps he had left behind. And in the end, I had something far more valuable than he could ever take away. My freedom. A year had passed since Mark left. The time had flown by, but it had also been filled with more growth, more self-discovery, and more success than I could have imagined. The boutique was thriving beyond anything I had anticipated. It had become a brand, an empire that represented everything I had fought for and believed in. During this time, I had even begun speaking at business conferences, sharing my story of overcoming betrayal and finding strength in the face of adversity. Women would come up to me after my talks, thanking me for showing them that they, too, could rise from the ashes of their own broken relationships. And each time, I felt a new sense of purpose. The media had started to take notice of my success. Local business magazines featured my story, celebrating my resilience and my accomplishments. I was no longer just the woman who had been left behind. I was a successful entrepreneur, a force to be reckoned with. Ironically, it was during one of these media interviews that I saw Mark again. He had tried to get back in touch once or twice, but I had ignored him completely. This time, he didn't approach me. Instead, he stood across the room, watching me. His face was different. Older, worn. The arrogance that had once been there was gone, replaced by something else. Regret, perhaps. But it didn't matter anymore. I was no longer that woman who had been left broken. I was no longer the one who had begged for his love or forgiveness. I was the woman who had rebuilt her life from scratch. I had moved on from his betrayal and had created something far more valuable than he could ever understand. A life on my terms. As I left the event that day, a sense of pride washed over me. Mark's betrayal had been the catalyst for me transformation. It had pushed me to my limits, made me stronger, and had driven me to succeed in ways I never thought possible. And while he continued to struggle with his own mistakes, I walked away with everything I had worked for. The last laugh, the last victory, was mine. I had learned the most important lesson of all. The best revenge is success. As I looked back at the life I had created, the one I had built from the ground up, I couldn't help but smile. I had everything I needed, and it was all because I had chosen to move on, to let go, and to never look back.